Ukraine is the new religion of the left.
How do we know how money is being spent?
He will tell you what you need to hear.
We're risking World War III.
The corruption in Ukraine.
We are supporting Nazis.
We cannot trust our own media.
Freedom of religion is being suppressed by Zelensky.
We don't know where money is going.
Putin needs to make sure there's a buffer between him and NATO.
Ukraine was terrorizing and committing acts of genocide on Russian-speaking population.
How does America benefit from sending all the support that it's sending?
We're crazy, don't mess with us.
We have our own problems in the United States.
We have to protect Ukraine for Ukrainians. Like, there's no place here for others.
Welcome to Spitting Seeds. Today I have a good friend of mine, Yuri Kurat. Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yuri Kurat.
Yes, that's good. And today we'll be talking about Ukraine. Lately, a lot of questions have been coming up. Well, it's been, how long has it been since the war started? February of last year, so we're over a year already.
Yeah, well, a year and 3 months.
And a lot of objections, issues, questions about the war in Ukraine. I have friends that they claim not to be pro-Russia, but they tend to be very anti-Zelensky. And then I receive clips, memes, questions about certain topics that's concerned with the war. I know you're more informed than I am, more informed than a lot of people on Ukraine. So today I want to ask those tough questions, tough topics to bring up and discuss together, and hopefully bring some light to, I don't know, would you call them conspiracy theories or propaganda objections?
Well, some of them are, but others are legitimate questions that need to be discussed, and there's legitimate problems that need to be solved. It's not like Ukraine is all white, and there's problems that need to be solved for sure internally. So we within Ukraine, people are saying we have two enemies. One is the outer enemy, which is the Russia trying to invade, and another one is from within, which is corruption. So treading that needle is actually, it's pretty nuanced.
So today I want to bring up from different topics. From the biggest one, I think most common that comes up is finances and all the money that we're sending to, where it's going and how it's getting spent. To is an escalation. Isn't getting more support to Ukraine? Doesn't that call for escalation from Russia? Isn't all the support leading to World War III, through Nazis being in Ukraine, through Candace Owens? I wanted to address all of those. Yeah. And that was a little retention hack. I was like, we're going to talk about all those things in this episode. But first one, by providing Ukraine with bigger and better weapons, aren't we risking escalation?
Okay, so behind every question, there's a question, right? And usually when people are asking questions in public, there's something they want to say by it. So, many people in, let's say, Platonian manner, I'll say, I'll just ask questions and you can answer yourselves. But then a lot of questions would have the answers in themselves. So the topic of escalation is one of those self-imposed red lines that the West had put on themselves. It's not the rhetoric of Russia that if we're going to escalate, we're going to escalate. It's the people who do not want to be involved in the war in Ukraine. They're using this as a pretext to say, why are we trying to help Ukraine? For example, I think at some point Argentina was saying, well, we're not going to send any aid to Ukraine because we're going to multiply war. We're going to multiply death. But that's, of course, a tone-deaf and completely misleading statement, because we're not talking about two countries going at each other. We're talking about a huge country invading a smaller country, which is obviously in a disadvantaged position and has been since 2014. So if anybody's escalating, it's Putin, because it started with an invasion, but then it proceeded to hiring international mercenaries like Syrians and people from the Middle East. Then it proceeded to bombing the Ukrainian peaceful infrastructure and energy infrastructure, which is outside of bounds of the war. So at any of these points, Putin has been escalating. But why are we not talking about Putin escalating? He has no qualms about doing more and more things, more and more atrocities. Starting with Bucha and so on. And we're not saying, seeing Putin is escalating, we should help Ukraine more. We're only talking about escalation when we're trying to send trying to help Ukraine resist. So it's not a question of are we going to multiply casualties or we're going to intensify fighting. What we're doing here, and it's clearly the point, is that we're helping a country in a disadvantaged position to repel an enemy who is going on this barbaric expansionist war.
So the support or better weapons, stronger weapons, what West would be doing is providing better defense for Ukraine, not for Ukraine to go and take over Russia or take over other countries. It's for them to have a better defense, a better protection for their own country.
Correct. So another way you can look at this is we're protecting the world order as it has been agreed on by international law. And by international law, the Ukrainian border is within the 1991 borders. So what Russia is doing is breaking the international law. So what does the rest of the world do? It should restore the order of things by providing the country that's being attacked with everything they need, short of actually sending people there. And thankfully, that's not come to that. And because of Ukrainian courage and of the armed forces, which have been training since 2014, this has been possible. So it's definitely not a question of escalation, or because escalation is a very abstract term. We're talking about one aggression of one country against a defense of others. You're correct that Ukraine is never going to go into Russia or trying to take any new territory. We don't need that. What Ukraine needs is to protect its own borders. And
you said restoring or protecting the world order and the laws that have existed. Another argument is that by providing support for Ukraine, we're risking World War III. What would you say to that?
Well, let's be more specific. I think the argument goes that we're risking World War III because of the use of last resort, which is the nuclear weapons. And there is, it's not a zero chance that it will not happen. Putin is a pretty strong dictator and a warmonger. Whether we're risking World War III does not depend on whether we repel Russia or not. Because what we know for sure is that if we don't, then Russia will be encouraged by their victory over Ukraine. It will start moving westward, and the next country after Ukraine would be either Poland or Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. And at that point, we're in Article 5 territory, which means that the entire bloc, the entire NATO bloc, will have to engage, and then that's World War III. So I would say helping Ukraine actually prevents World War III, because if you can wear down Russian army in Ukraine just using weapons and money, that's a great proposition for the rest of the world.
And the argument can be made from Putin's side, like, no, he doesn't want to take over the rest of the world. But if we look at his history of him from the very beginning when he entered Crimea, am I correct? That he was making promises that he will not invade Crimea. And then after he invaded Crimea, he said, oh, that's all we want. We just want the ports. And then he invaded more. And then he got those territories, and then he invaded further. So we already have a history of him claiming that, I don't want a lot. I just want this part, and that's it, and I'm done. And as long as you seize these territories to Russia, I'll be done with my attacks.
Well, I mean, even within mine in your lifetime, we can see that Russia had made enemies with pretty much everybody around them, and it had to do with territorial conflict. Georgia in 2008, and then around the same time, maybe 2009, Estonia, and then Ukraine, and then they do have ambition, even though it's not said on the presidential level in Russia. But we do hear deputies, MPs from Duma who say, actually our territory is everything up to the English Strait. They definitely have that ambition, and you hear different people, generals. They're said, the next would be Poland, next would be Estonia. Of course, Putin has enough state of mind not to spew out any such nonsense, but from history, even the most recent history, we see that they do have this imperial expansionist ambition.
And for World War III or the nuclear war, wouldn't that mean the suicide for Putin and all his buddies, and they're not as crazy and they're not as suicidal as they would like us to think.
Yeah, there's this interesting myth that I think they're trying to propagate, is that, we're crazy, don't mess with us, because if you do this little, we will respond unproportionately and we will do a lot more. But first of all, that's not happened so far, because let's say in last summer, the first HIMARS systems, like six or eight HIMARS systems, were shipped to Ukraine, and that actually turned the tide of the war. Instead of just being on the defense, we actually were able to go on the offense. And then in September, we took back huge swaths of territory because of the long-range artillery and movable artillery like HIMARS. And that should have triggered a proportionate response. Nothing had happened. Then later that year, Ukraine, allegedly had bombed the Kerch bridge, which is the Crimea bridge, by Russia's own defense doctrine. That should have triggered the nuclear response, because it's an attack on their territory, or what they consider to be their territory. Of course, from Ukrainian standpoint, it's a nezakonna zabudova, right? It's an illegal structure, and still no response. The only response from them was weak, was from a military standpoint, was just to start bombing energy infrastructure. So we see that the proportionality or the escalation talk, that's not happening. We see that the West is becoming more and more bold on supporting Ukraine, sending it more powerful weapons, but we're not seeing anything from Russia's side. So all we see is that they're using this thuggish strategy to hurt the ones who cannot protect themselves, because they know that the military targets to them are unreachable in that way.
The whole idea, we're crazy, we're fine with dying because everybody else is going to die, but we're going to go to heaven. And that theory also doesn't add up of how Putin treated himself during COVID, of how paranoid he was of any COVID stuff related. And here the big talk is like, we don't care, we can die tomorrow, we're going to be proud of it. And yet the signs of him trying to live as long as he can is his behavior during COVID.
It's interesting. In the last week, there's been a lot of talk about Putin's doppelgangers, or like doubles, which are traveling around the country, because some interesting footage of him being in Mariupol, and then recently he's visited the war territory. And the same question as you're raising was the main stumbling block is really Putin, because how can you at the same time be so overprotective of yourself, having these landing strips of tables, and having people sit 20 meters from you because you're afraid of germs, and then going to Mariupol and hugging strangers? That's not the same person. So, so you're correct that he does value life. He likes life. And if you've ever seen any of videos that the opposition leader Navalny had put out on all the villas and everything they have, these people love their life. So when I think it was, if it wasn't Jens Stoltenberg, the secretary of NATO, then somebody else up there in leadership who had said, if Putin uses as much as a tactical nuclear weapon, there will be consequences personally to him, which basically means that we will target you directly. And the US has been, I should rather say NATO has been developing this smaller nuclear device which can actually penetrate deep underground, which targeting bunkers. So I think that stopped him in his tracks. And I think what you mentioned, the mutually assured destruction tactics and these direct threats, they do work against him, because it's not like Putin, he's trying to, as you said, build a image of himself like, I'm crazy, don't mess with me, just give me everything I want, which did make a lot of Western politicians say, how about we cede some territory? Even Trump, cede some territory, will just appease him. But of course, it's plainly easy to see that such tactic will actually encourage him to go further rather than stop him.
And also, it's beneficial for him to continue living and enjoying his life. And also, his boys, his squad around him, it's much more beneficial for them to wait out his old age. And you never know, whenever he dies, goes away, they have a chance at power, grabbing power that is left, the power vacuum that's left after Putin leaves, dies, whatever. But if they encourage him, if they push him towards anything nuclear, anything World War related, that means it's suicide for all of them. They have no chance at any power, any money, any all of that stuff for themselves. So it's not beneficial for any of them, for World War III, for nuclear stuff to happen.
In fact, we already started seeing some of the infighting that's happening in the Putin's elites. So, for example, I'm not sure if you noticed, but the Chechen leader Kadyrov, he's nowhere to be seen for like a couple of months. He's solving his own problems, but the main vector of attack right now is between the chief of Wagner, Prigozhin, and Shoigu, who's the defense minister of Russia. They're clearly feuding, and they're trying to show each other in the light of being traitors to Putin. So they're already starting to think, in my mind, past Putin and what's going to happen, and they're vying for a position in a government after him.
Okay, so first we talked about, by providing bigger, better weapons, it will lead to escalation. Even more so, it can lead to World War III, nuclear war. Another question, why is the United States involved at all? It's a conflict between two neighboring countries. They're somehow similar. They have past history. Leave them alone. Let them figure out. We get no benefit from it. It's just family fighting between themselves. How does America benefit from sending all the support that it's sending to that war?
Yeah. So it's a talking point which is totally misleading that, U.S. it's so far away from everybody else. There's two big oceans between anything that's happening. We really have no dog in this fight. But that's not true. It might have been true when the United States was just declaring its independence. But even then, friends did step in on the side of the revolutionaries and helped, which is why we have a lot of streets named Lafayette, for example, here in the States. But also throughout the world, the more the economy has been interconnected and traveling and stuff like that, countries which have bigger economic potential, bigger military potential, have started to take part into what's going on in the world, and to preserve their own position in the world, their own economies as well. They need to stay involved in what's going on in the world. For example, much touted theory about the Iraq war and the oil prices, right? And I don't totally believe that, because actually the United States has never extracted, an ounce from Iraq. But the pattern is definitely true. So, for example, the United States, it's taking part in a lot of these conflicts because they need to control the activity of terrorist organizations, for example, because like 9/11. They missed a step, right? Because they didn't understand what was going on in Afghanistan with Al Qaeda, and they couldn't track what was going on. So economy is a big thing, next big thing, because for example, Ukraine is exporting. I haven't looked up the statistic recently, but exporting a lot of grain into Europe and into Africa, which stabilizes those countries. You don't have hunger riots, for example. If we looked at this question purely in a vacuum, then you could say, well, U.S. could stay out of it. But for example, there's history to it. For example, in 1996, the United States was interested that Ukraine does not hold any nuclear weapons. So they intervened and they said, how about this, Ukraine? You send most of your weapons to Russia, and to ensure that you're not left defenseless, we're going to sign a memorandum for you. We're going to guarantee your territorial integrity. And there was 7 countries who undersigned, Russia being one of them, Great Britain, France, United States. So back then, America understood that Ukraine is entering in a turbulent time in the 90s, but they have nuclear weapons. We better do something about it because we're vulnerable. So, and now Ukraine is sort of calling in that memorandum and saying, well, you promised that you would guarantee our integrity. How about territorial integrity? How about you help us now? So there's a history to it. So to sum up, there's 2 reasons. One is that it's not true that it does not touch America at all. Of course it does, because Russia growing more powerful, more aggressive, has a direct impact against United States. And secondly is because promises were made, because back 20, 25 years ago, it was beneficial for United States to make a pact for Ukraine. And now it's time to honor that promise. And what, it's not only Zelensky who's saying this, but it's sort of a common knowledge. When I was talking to General Ben Hodges, he said the same thing, is that it's better for us to fight by sending aid, weapons, humanitarian aid, stuff like that, and finances over, than to fight with our own flesh and blood. So, and that's what's happening in Ukraine. The way I like to put it is, it's not a war on Ukraine. It's the Russia's war on the West. Ukraine is just the front lines. Mm-hmm. So that's the correct way to look at it.
And again, the question or the concern would be, not even concern, looking for a right word. The one would argue that, well, it's not a front line, because if we give them Ukraine, or we give them half of Ukraine, Putin would stop and he wouldn't go further. He just wants to have buffer and protection. That leads to the next question of,
why wouldn't he? That's ridiculous.
The question of NATO.
Yeah.
The question comes up of, well, it's Ukraine's fault for this war. It's they're brought upon themselves because they kept up the talks of joining NATO. Therefore, Putin is justified by having this buffer for NATO. So NATO broke its promise by saying, we're not going to go east anymore. They broke its promise. Mm-hmm. They're threatening to move more east. Therefore, Putin needs to make sure there's a buffer between him and NATO. Therefore, he's justified by invading Ukraine.
There's a lot of points here. So let's try to unpack it. Mm-hmm. Number one, about Putin stopping if we give him half of Ukraine. There's no reason for him to stop. Like, when you give way to a bully, do they stop? Can you kind of give them enough? And there's never enough. They're insatiable. I can completely see how Putin will go after Baltic countries next because of the historical justice, as he's putting it, because all three Baltic countries were part of the Soviet Union. So Stalin annexed them, I think, right after the start of the Second World War. So Putin can say, well, these territories are ours. Why shouldn't we go after what is ours? Then and Königsberg, which is Kaliningrad, Russian Kaliningrad now, is there. So we have to have a land passageway there, because they currently only have sea or air, which is the same argument they used for Mariupol, because it's a land pathway to Crimea. So it's extremely naive to think that Putin will stop if we give him little territory. That's not how aggressors behave. Okay, so secondly, we have to talk a little bit about bipolar world or multipolar world. So these governments don't think like we think in terms of like, well, you have enough, have fertile land, enjoy it. They think in terms of influence. So like right now we see a big standoff, for example, between the United States and China, because China is actively trying to get more influence, and they're trying to dance with France, and France is saying we need to be independent from the hegemony of the United States, and we're an independent country and stuff like that. So the way Russian state thinks about their role is not only about land or about resources, it's also about influence. Mm-hmm. So with how much time Putin himself has attributed in his speeches and writings and articles and stuff about their historicity and the special way, the third way, or the Moscow being the third Rome and stuff like that, we see that Ukraine is of vital importance to Russia, because that's where Russia started, basically. Mm-hmm. Because if there is no Rus, right, there was no Kievska Rus, then there is no Russia, because now you're just a bunch of Finno-Hungarian tribes. You have no history. And for example, Catherine II was trying to put together a narrative of where Russia comes from, because having sort of a glorious past, having this national fable, helps build the future. And actually everybody's doing it. The state's doing it, and it's all right. But just the way Russia is doing it is is in a very aggressive way. So they need to have that influence. And the third thing I forgot, what was the argument
NATO.
again?
So it's Ukraine's fault because NATO was trying to move more east. Putin needs to have a buffer between NATO and Russia.
Correct. So this narrative actually started with a professor at Chicago University, and he has a lecture called "Putin is our fault." Putin is the West's fault, something like that. And the idea is that Putin was just living there, happily, not thinking anything aggressive. But then, and in the 90s, they were NATO leadership gave promise to the Putin that will not expand east. But then, as Putin himself said, but then they broke their promise. They started expanding east. They started to build their bases closer and closer to Russia. So what can we do? We just had to invade. We had to act. And well, two things. Number one is when you merely want to protect yourself from NATO, as for example, Tucker Carlson would tell you, then you don't do it by bombing peaceful infrastructure in Ukraine. You don't do it by raping women and children. You don't do it by committing acts of war crimes on that territory if you're merely there to protect. These actions of what Russian forces are doing in Ukraine, they speak not of defensive behavior, but actually of aggressive imperialist, barbaric actions. Okay, that's argument number one. You don't behave that way if you're merely acting out of defense. Number two is that we're taking agencies out of all the countries who had wanted to join NATO. It's not like NATO is forcing anybody to join. It's not like NATO is propagating anybody to join. Countries seeing Russia's behavior want to have some security in numbers. They understand that if they join the Western powers, let's say the allies, and if we can symbolize it that way, they will be protected from Russia's unrelenting aggression towards every one of their neighbors. So in this sense, are we saying that the Baltic countries, Turkey, Hungary, are they pawns now? Do they not have their own agency? Do they not have their own will? Of course they do, and it's you're not thinking much of the countries. I'm trying to say it politely. To say, well, NATO has been expanding. NATO has not been expanding. Countries had wanted to join NATO, and the biggest testament to this argument is that since the start of Russia's war against Ukraine, two countries had voluntarily wanted to join because they understood if they didn't have the protection of a bigger bloc, they could be in trouble, which is Finland and Sweden. And effectively, what do we see as a result? Trying to oppose NATO, trying to defend against NATO, Russia had doubled the border that they have with NATO, right? So that argument that it's NATO's fault for war in Ukraine, it just doesn't hold any water.
So is there just an excuse that he's using to expand Russian territory, and it's what he calls glory of Soviet Union? Yeah. He mentioned several times and mentions that often that the biggest mistake was for the Soviet Union fall apart. Yeah. And he directly or indirectly pledged to restore the glory of the Soviet Union. And this is one of his excuses to expand that territory.
Of course, Russia displays a typical imperialist behavior. It's something that in the Soviet Union they condemned all over the world. They're saying, "Oh, we're going to decolonize. We have to come to a post-colonial world." But what they're doing is actually establishing colonies. So the DNR, LNR are basically colonies of Russia, and then formally, of course, this wasn't the real reason, but formally, the Russia went into Ukraine was to protect the two new republics from neo-Nazis in Ukraine. So of course, this is aggressive expansionist behavior, and you can tell that they're running out of ideas of how to explain what they're doing. So that's why the argumentation for the war had changed like 7 times.
Because when on February 23rd to February 24th, when Putin announced the special operation in Ukraine, what was the reason that he provided for the war?
Two reasons. One is the two goals was the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine.
Okay, so first one, denazification. What do they have, or did they have in mind for them being justified sending military for denazification? What was the story they had for their people to explain, like, this is why we need to go there?
Yeah, so the narrative was that back in 2014, the legally elected president Yanukovych was forcibly deposed, had to flee the country, and they still consider him to be the legitimate president of Ukraine, and who took power in his stead was this faction of neo-Nazis who are now terrorizing the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. So, and the Russian-speaking population would be the eastern, but even like where I'm from, in Cherkasy, most of the town, before the war, used to speak Russian as well. Mm-hmm. So he would take on this responsibility, just as Hitler would, any, pan-German world. Everybody, German-speaking nations have to be protected. So they did use initially that narrative that these are neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and the reason they used it is because there is this death cult going from the World War II in Russia that they're trying to call to. So, for example, like every March 9th, they call it the День Победы, which is the Victory Day, when the rest of the world calls it Day of Remembrance. Like, the rest of the world does not celebrate war, but we see that with Russia, they have these huge military parades. So with pronouncing denazification, they're trying to call back to revive this old memory of Деды воевали, our grandfathers who stood for this country against the Nazis. But look, now these Nazis are in Ukraine. We have to do this again. Our time has come. So it's a weird mix of kind of pseudo-religious, political, and social reasoning that they used and put into the denazification.
So that was one of the two reasons for the war. But I think for all the people that grew up in Ukraine, have relatives in Ukraine, have our parents, grandparents growing up in Ukraine, in recent history, we've never heard of Nazis terrorizing random people in Ukraine, Russian speaking, and there could be a weirdo too. Out of if you have 42 million people in the country, you will have some weird people with weird views, the same way we have KKK people in the United States. But that does not justify China to take over America because of KKK group somewhere in the south. So it's weird that Putin announces his reason for the war and said, here's one of the reasons. And we say, oh, no, that's not why. It's because of NATO. And it's like, well, that's not what he said when he was starting the war. What about the second one, demilitarization? What, in his mind or his side of the story that he had in mind when he said demilitarization in Ukraine?
Well, we should make a difference between the goals and the justification. So, yeah, goals were denazification, demilitarization. Demilitarization basically means that there's not going to be a military opposition to his forces in Ukraine. The reasons that he gave was that Ukraine was terrorizing and committing acts of genocide on Russian-speaking population. Okay. Right. So that was, and demilitarization was more of a practical goal. Like we're going to take it out. And I think more boastful because I think they had to walk that back pretty fast.
Okay. Another objection. We have our own problems in the United States. We have, plenty on our plate to deal with. Why mess with Ukraine? We touched on it a little bit, but more specifically, how does U.S. benefit from being involved in Ukraine? And we'll go in depth into like finances, Zelensky, corruption.
Right.
But besides spending money, how does what's the benefit do we get from focusing on Ukraine, spending money there? Why not just spend all that money here in the States and deal with our own problems here?
Correct. So globally, the benefit is world order, in which United States has a very good, big interest. So, for example, even though I do not agree with this argument 100%. But the reason for the recent inflation and gas prices was partly because of the war in Ukraine, because much of Europe had said no to Russian oil, for example, and the United States had cut back the purchase of oil. Of course, I do agree mostly with the argument that the inflation in the United States was caused by the stimulus programs during COVID, and which was unbased, and I agree with all that. But also, you can see how those ripples continues. Is that in a globalized world, anything that happens on a significant scale does have an impact on what's happening in the United States. So economic impact is one, defense is another, because Russia does have ICBMs, right? That will reach all the major cities on the coast. On either coast. So, and even though that seems far-fetched, but intervention in Ukraine seemed far-fetched as well. So Russia is a big country which has aggressive tendencies, and which in various times been more or less aggressive. So it is in the United States' interest to keep Russia's influence limited in that part of the world. And also, and this is something that General Ben Hodges told me, is United States does have an interest in Europe as their biggest trading partner. And stability in Europe means more trade, lower prices, more economic benefit to the United States. So the same people who would say it's not our deal, we're barely surviving, living hand to mouth in the United States, why do we have to meddle with Ukraine? They would be the same people who would feel the impact of rising grocery prices, gas prices in the United States as well. So those two things are interconnected. Secondly, as far as how much are not we, I'm Ukrainian, but how much are United States spending on this defense? So far, it's been around $70 billion. I looked over the 20 years in Afghanistan. The United States has spent $2.3 billion.
Trillion.
You're right. $1 trillion. So we're not even close there in relation to the budget of the United States. I think the figure is 2.5 or 3% of the defense budget. And for that price, and somebody had calculated it per capita too. They're saying it's like $14 per month per household, like they're paying to support Ukraine. So for that price, wearing Russia down and denigrating their army, that's a very good deal. And I agree with Zelensky, who said, let us fight. We were not inviting anybody to come into Ukrainian territories. There's not going to be boots on the ground. We don't need that. We have our own army. We can withstand. We can fight our own battles. What we do need is armaments, weapons, aid, and stuff like that.
And the question that you brought up with sending money, military help there, and I think that's the one that comes up the most often when we see these bills that are being voted in support of Ukrainian war, military and other things. The numbers is always in billions, tens of billions, and people have very hard time with that. Mm-hmm. One of the questions or one of the objections is always all this money is going to a corrupt Ukraine, and always Zelensky. Zelensky has been painted as this evil, horrible person that we're sending tens of billions of dollars to, mm-hmm. as if it's being wired into his personal bank account, and then he decides what to do with that. Mm-hmm. So, first question, when all the money that's being approved by U.S. government as assistance for Ukraine, what happens to that money? Is that just a fat amount of billions of dollars just getting wired into Zelensky's bank account, or what happens to that money?
Most of it is not money. Most of it is military aid. So, for example, this recent package was announced for $325 million. That is, I think none of it is money. All of it is just extra rounds, because Ukraine is running out of, I think, 155 millimeter rounds for M777 systems. And most of the stuff, when you hear it, it's not like we're sending huge wires of money. Most of it is weapons, recently tanks, its instructors and their time. There is one controversial, sort of controversial in some circles, that U.S. does help to pay salaries of some of the infrastructure workers in Ukraine. And the reality is that since the beginning of the war, I think pretty much right away we lost 50% of our economy. Right? Mm-hmm. I think it's starting to recover somewhat, but 50% is a rough correct number. So in order to keep the machine running, the payments being paid out, the machine, the apparatus to be stable, we do need that support as well. Mm-hmm. And it's so you could consider it to be an infrastructure payments as well. But of course, it does ruffle a lot of feathers, like, we're high unemployment and stuff like that in the United States. Why are we paying apparatchiks in Ukraine? Mm-hmm. So that one, but that is pennies compared to the rest of the aid.
And the military that's being bought, majority, if not all of it, is American military equipment. So that money is being approved.
It goes in the American economy.
Economy, American, what would call military, would they be military complex?
Military industrial complex,
military companies. So majority of them, or most of the money, is going to those companies, not necessarily just cash being transferred into Ukrainian fund, correct?
No, of course not. So there is a portion of it that's being allocated for humanitarian aid. Mm-hmm. But again, that's being bought like in Europe, like in Germany. So for example, right now, Ukraine has a few million like the generator machines. Mm-hmm. And that's needed just because since the October, Russians have been bombing the energy infrastructure and there have been blackouts in various cities. So those generators are what was needed back then and what was important. It's not like, people are handing out money. There's controls in place. And we could talk about, the objections about we don't know where this money is being spent.
Yeah. So how do we how do we know how money is being spent?
We don't know where money is going is one of those questions, which is really not a question, right? Because, and there's a simple test to that. Because let's say if somebody's asking you, well, we don't know where money's going, and you say, if I told you where money was going, would you be okay with money going, right? And of course, the pretext is that no, it's all a murky scheme. Ukraine is corrupt. They're all purchasing. In fact, I caught this. Candace Owens was a few months back on Tucker Carlson show, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm just back from England," and her husband is English, I think, and all the talk in Europe is about how these Ukrainian oligarchs are buying property all over Europe, and she's like, oh, I wonder why is that? What money they're using to buy that? And of course, this is all heavy conjecture. Like there's nothing journalistic about anything she said. And of course, apart from her, there is MAGA boys and girls like Lauren Boebert and Max Gaetz and that crowd who's saying, well, we are not seeing where this is going, so we're not we're opposed to it. But again, if you ask, what if somehow you knew where this was going? Would you be in favor of helping Ukraine? And of course, the answer is no. But let's try to answer the question as it stands. Mm-hmm. Right now, where's the money going? There are several schemes in between the military agencies in Ukraine and the United States, which do monitor and have that reporting. One of the problems that the United States has had with using general systems and software they've been using before is that they do not know how to account for military aid being sent without the personnel. Because all of the conflicts that the United States was involved in before, in Afghanistan, Iraq, or in the recent years, they took into account we're sending the whole package. There's boots on the ground, there's military operations, there's supply lines and stuff like that. In Ukraine, it's different, right? So there was some chaos in what we send there. How do we track it? But the real question is, why are we asking this question? Has there been any allegations that the aid being sent to Ukraine is misappropriated?
Any evidence?
Any evidence, right? And in fact, we know that this is not the case because the chairman of the committee I forgot, it's the long name. I use it in the video, which I recorded about the objections to Ukraine. It was like committee for, I'm not giving a ton of it. So she's on record as saying, we see no evidence of the weapon systems that we're sending to be used in any other capacity, but to the purpose that on which they're sent. So she said this, I think, in December, and then recently she's repeated the same statement. Like, we're not seeing that anything fishy is going on. And two more arguments. One is, it's easy to see where the money is going, because you see that Ukrainian army, which at the beginning of this war had only like shoulder-mounted javelins.
That was wild days.
Things could really go either way back then. And it really, sticks could repel huge, like 200,000 personnel advancing army with tanks and helicopters and stuff like that. That's where the money is going. We see that Ukraine had turned the tide of the war, and it's for sure not because we threw sticks at them, or used old Soviet AK-47s. It's because we've had the long-reaching artillery, which was able to, pound the ground before we were able to go in and free those territories, like Kherson, like Kharkiv, and so forth. So on the one hand, it's easy to see it's going towards the victory of Ukraine, and
because we see the results of the war.
Exactly, and this is why, like, the counterattack of Ukraine that's coming up in the coming weeks. That's why it's important for Ukraine to show to the Western partners that the aid that you're giving is not going in vain. We are having success, right? And so that's evidence number one. And number two is, well, how do you answer the question? We don't know where money is going. Like, at which level do you want to see? Do you want to see a report down to every dollar? Well, that's not going to happen for a few years, right? Because in the fog of war, you do what you need to do. But at which level is this question going to be satisfactory? Like, any way you try to answer it, the respondent can say, well, that's just not detailed enough. I still don't see the picture.
How do I know it actually went there? Even if you show the full accounting of it, the follow-up question could be, well, how do I know this is true? You showed me the spreadsheets, the details of everything. Well, I don't believe it. I think it's fake. Yeah. So how do you prove to a person that this is where the money is actually going?
Especially if you're a regular city goer, right? If you don't work for a military agency or anything like that, how do you prove anything? Another thing I can say about this is the proof that Ukraine is not misappropriating this fund, it's not stealing, it's not Zelensky trying to buy it. Zelensky's a rich dude. He was in show business. I'm not buying that narrative. But what the evidence you can see is that Ukrainians en masse, I haven't actually seen this all my life living in Ukraine, up until like 6 years ago. I haven't seen Ukrainians being so financially generous towards a cause, because a lot of the stuff that the soldiers have on them, they have not been sourced from anywhere in the West, because the West is concerned with like big stuff, big guns and everything. But a lot of the like night vision systems, additional protection and accessories for machine guns and stuff like that, that's being crowdsourced from Ukraine. Like, people who know, I know somebody who's went off to war, let's equip this guy, and then everybody is pitching into this stuff. So Ukrainians have not only literally their skin in the game, but they also are contributing their finances for the victory. We are not a welfare queen. We're not taking money for nothing. We're not misappropriating the funds. We're there fighting the war for the rest of the Western world.
And I think what a lot of times when these attacks happen or objections are being raised, it will start off with, well, I feel bad for people of Ukraine, but Zelensky, he's shady to me. He's weird to me. And again, the whole idea, though, is being misdirected, that the money is not going to the government of Ukraine. It's going directly to Zelensky. And Zelensky, this shady guy, pocketing huge chunks of all this money for himself, decides how to spend this money. Where does this come from? Where it's not that we're sending money to Ukraine, we're sending money directly to Zelensky.
Yeah, this is a narrative, a completely false narrative that comes from a more radical part of the conservative movement. I consider myself to be a conservative as well, more centrist right. But there's a group within the Republican Party today, which, like Marjorie Taylor Greene is probably the most flamboyant example of this, who are trying to change the narrative from we're helping a nation under attack withstand and protect their own territory to we're sending our hard-earned money to a corrupt politician. That's a total. There's no defense for it. You're not sending to Zelensky. Zelensky doesn't see any of this. He only not any of this, but like most of this, because it goes through directly from agency to agency. Like so, for example, the Ministry of Defense, they have under their umbrella have a bunch of agencies which receive funds and then send them forth, stuff like that. Zelensky only has 24 hours in a day, and his main goal right now is to make sure that people don't forget that there's a major war going on in the middle of Europe, and which is why he's doing all this press and media and stuff like that. I think they're confusing Zelensky for Putin. Putin is the kind of guy who has all the power and controls every little facet of everything that goes on. So in Russia, Ukraine is kind of moving past this already, but Russia's had this structure where everything sort of trickles up, starting from a ment or like a police guy and in the street kind of doing rackets over little kiosks and kind of kicks up the chain all the time. So that's the impression I get of what's happening in Russia, because a lot of these elites, for example, the oligarchs, how did they become oligarchs? They were able to buy huge strategic economic infrastructure, like plants for pennies. And why was that possible? Because the government sort of let them do that. So they're not more of a like their own made man like Jeff Bezos would be, but they were more of they're appointed to look after these. So they all are beholden to Putin. And in Ukraine, it used to be that way. But what we see with Zelensky, because for example, when he became president, you may remember that a lot of people thought, well, he's just a puppet of a Ukrainian oligarch. What was his name? From Dnipro.
Yes. Gray hair.
Yeah, little glasses.
Yeah.
People at home already have figured it out. but there was fears like that because he was meeting him. But since then, Zelensky had rid this guy of Ukrainian citizenship because of the shady schemes that he had. So it's not like that in Ukraine. Kolomoisky, that's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're not seeing this top-down structure in Ukraine. Ukraine is a pretty democratic state.
And then the whole idea of Zelensky being this evil guy, and I feel like it's so, what's the word, like very Western, like American, like we know better, has an effect on this, is that we see the support of Ukrainian people for Zelensky. So if he was this evil, horrible guy, wouldn't the people in the country see the most accurately? And his support skyrocketed during the war.
Yeah.
They see what he's doing. They see the results. They see what he's doing for the country.
Yeah.
And we from outside in look and saying, well, no, Ukrainian people supporting Zelensky, well, they're just dumb. They're just being fooled. Yeah. We know better than the people on the ground that see him 24/7 and have a lot more at stake than we do here living here in America. So that's, I think, another evidence for Zelensky being not as horrible, as evil as some of him make him out to be. Not necessarily like he's perfect, but we see his support from the people that live with him in the country and see what he's doing for the country.
Correct. So, I mean, multifaceted question, of course, and your argument is, because you can say, well, most people support Putin as well. But what we've been able to see is that Zelensky has been able to step up his game really, really fast. Because, for example, I voted for the other guy. I voted for Poroshenko in the last election. And I was really I was dismayed that Zelensky won. I was like, oh, this guy, because his election campaign was pretty aggressive, And I thought, this is such a gauche move to put out a populist show about, Sluga Naroda and to then say, well, this was my campaign. It was just a dumb move. So I was disappointed. But I think at this stage, he's doing what he's doing. I think a lot of people are going to start criticizing him after he's out. And this is how democracy works. For example, Winston Churchill was ousted, voted out of his office 2 months after World War II, even though he pretty much from this single-handedly brought Britain and then the Allies through the war just on his back. He did a magnificent task. So I think similarly with Zelensky, and this will be the actual test of democracy, is a lot of the voices who had been criticizing him, including me, we understand that at the time of war, let all those political things rest for a little bit because we have an enemy. So we need to support and because right now he is the representative of Ukraine in the world and we need to support him. But you're correct. The entire narrative of him being this evil dictator who's trying to pull the world in World War III it's made up. I was so disappointed and flabbergasted by my favorite Daily Wire. I had to drop my subscription because, for example, Matt Walsh, I thought he was clever, and I thought the documentary he did, What is a Woman, was brilliant, right? Mm-hmm. As much as obvious things can be brilliant, which they often are. That was great, I think. But then when you see, people start talking out of school, like those things they don't understand, you lose a lot of respect for them. Yeah, and this is what's happening in the States. They're trying to build narratives within the American society to advance their own goals, which is all the more disgusting, right? Because if you want to criticize military-industrial complex of the United States, you want to criticize Biden, do that, but do not muddy the name of Ukraine for your own political goals. That's just disgusting. That's who does that,
And that's what Matt Walsh, especially I think the biggest one, the most passionate one, Candace Owens on Zelensky, and also the misrepresentation of Zelensky being this powerful, influential guy that's commanding U.S., Germany, France, all these countries what to do, and now they're kind of under his power or under his hand, and they have no choice because he's demanding help. At the end of the day, Zelensky is a guy stretched out with his hand, begging for help, asking for help for his country, for his people, for the territory of their country. But if you listen to somebody like Candace Owens, you would think this guy is the most powerful guy in the world. And now that he's demanding help, U.S. has no choice but to help. And I think the argument is the U.S. is helping because they choose to, because it is beneficial for them. Yeah. It's not because they're scared of Zelensky. It's not because they're under pressure from Zelensky. It's because it is beneficial to them. Zelensky is a no threat to United States or to Germany or France or Great Britain. Yeah. They're helping because it is beneficial to all of them, not because they're scared of Zelensky's speeches.
Yeah, I think Candace Owens just never had business dealings. It's like, what does Zelensky have to leverage or offer or hold over any of the countries to give help? All he can do is ask. Why would Germany do anything if they felt Zelensky was a threat? They're not being attacked. Their economy is intact. It just doesn't make any sense. It's totally made up.
And on topic of Candace Owens, because I think most often the objections that would come to me about Ukraine would be in some sort of paraphrase what Candace Owens said before. And she has a large following, especially for for young mothers. They listen, being conservative, and during the COVID vaccine stage, she gained a lot of popularity, and she's kind of like a mother speaking on protection of kids. So she has a big following from mothers. And then so a couple of things, and even today I was trying to refresh my memory on her objections, and you can see of how little evidence there is for anything corrupt, evil on a big scale happening in Ukraine just by the objections that she has for Zelensky. So she's passionately talking about, if I could punch her, popular line, if I could punch one person in the world and get away with it would be Zelensky.
Yeah, and she's scraping the bottom of the barrel with her argumentation.
Yeah, and her so some of her arguments, and I wrote them down, is is one of, like, I saw how she's not being legitimate or honest is recently Zelensky was doing a speech and he said, hey, it's beneficial for United States to help Ukraine to stop the expansion of Russia, because if US doesn't help now, if they go to Poland and other countries, that will trigger Article 5, and US will have to send their troops, their men, they'll have to die in the war protecting NATO countries. Candace clips out the clip of, hey, if you don't help now, you'll later will have to send your men, and they'll have to die. And she reacts like, can you believe this guy? He's demanding our troops to be sent and die on his behalf. And I was like, you legitimately clipped out that clip, so that's not being honest of you. And you did that just to get clicks and just to get a reaction to paint Zelensky in a negative way.
Yeah.
Even though she knew herself that it's not being done in a legitimate way.
Yeah.
So the question would be, why does she have to cut corners, cheat her way just to make an argument against Zelensky?
From my little experience as a podcast host, you're always under pressure to come up with interesting content. What I'm seeing in a lot of these personalities, they come out with a great thought, or a great agenda, and you're drawn to them because you see their authenticity. You want to, like, I learned about Candace through Blexit and during the BLM madness and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh yeah, totally. That's what she's saying is great. And I learned about a lot of personalities kind of in her environment. But then I think they're always under pressure to be relevant and to talk about stuff that's happening to advanced, their channels, their causes, whatever. But then when you speak out of the thin air and you don't know what you're talking about, you end up tarnishing your reputation. And this, unfortunately, has been the downfall of many, many bloggers. And unfortunately, like I love Daily Wire, but I think the stuff that she's doing is tarnishing the reputation of new conservative media. United States does need a good conservative media because most of the, especially like video content, has been on a liberal side, and young people are getting affected by all this leftist BS. So there is a special kind of mandate for conservative people to stick to what they know, to speak out of authority. Because when you see that Candace Owens is doing this kind of low quality, bottom of the barrel stuff, you're like, she's losing legitimacy. So it's sad to see, unfortunately.
Yeah, and to add, and we'll wanted to close out with like what we think the motivation for this is, and another one. So first is clearly edited clip out of context, and she knew that it's out of context. That shows that she doesn't have a legitimate evidence to paint Zelensky as a bad guy. Second thing that I saw again today was him doing his entertainment before and having weird, funny, what he thought would be funny skits, and he's like dancing in heels and a crop top, and she paints us like immoral and like, who is this guy? He's an actor. So my thing is like, well, she's fighting like for morality. Like, oh, if the guy is immoral, he's past in entertainment, and there's weird clips of him in past entertainment, and she has an issue with that, then wouldn't she have the same issue with Trump? So if she doesn't have the same issue with Trump, then the concern is not with him being immoral or him being weird, him having a past in entertainment or Hollywood. It's just finding something to show for Zelensky. And again, that shows, if you have to show a clip of him dancing in heels and a crop top and saying like, there's no way we can support this guy, shows that there's no evidence or legitimate evidence of corruption, of him being evil. And last one that she has a very big issue with, and she gets always very theatrical about it, is whenever Zelensky meets with any or does any work, Hollywood, any awards shows, meeting with any Hollywood people, and she's painting as a big act. Like, all it is he's just an actor meeting with other actors. She hates him, and he's a corrupt, evil guy because he's meeting with celebrities. Actors. And her argument is, you're in the war, so you have no time. You're busy. You're fighting the war. You have no time to meet with celebrities. Yeah. What's Zelensky's justification with spending time showing up to all these in video format to these award shows, meeting with celebrities? How does he have time? And what's the reason?
Answer.
And what's the reason for him spending time with them?
Well, it's simple. He needs to keep front of mind for a lot of people that there's war in Ukraine, and they need to support Ukraine. If not, financially, whoever is donating, but also by pressuring their local authorities to do something about it. The role of the president in the war is to be a representative of the war of the country in the rest of the world, and that's what he's doing. That he's, Sean Penn, Ben Stiller, all those people. I think Beyonce was in Lviv at some point. All that is to bring attention.
Angelina Jolie.
Angelina Jolie, yeah. So all that is to bring attention to what's going on in Ukraine, and that's what he's doing. That's why he's in all political conferences and stuff like that. That's why he's in award shows and stuff like that. He's doing everything he can. In no way this is a sign of him trying to be conceited or what. What is the allegation here? Of course he's everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that shows that if there was a legitimate evidence of him buying huge mansions, huge yachts somewhere, that of course would be a much better evidence of him being corrupt and this evil guy.
Yeah.
But the fact that you don't have that, so you can only speculate. So what you have to find is why is he wearing a sweater and not wearing a suit? Why is he meeting with celebrities? Which obviously his job is, one of his main jobs during the war is to bring awareness to the huge problem that he has in his country.
Yeah.
And by appearing with as many interviews, as many appearances as he can to bring awareness, and other stuff where she will intentionally edit out clips out of context. I think that's a huge evidence that she has nothing more serious to show for him, so she has to scrape for these random things and build up this huge hate for him just because he doesn't wear a suit, he meets with celebrities, he has weird skits from his past entertainment career.
It's a tragedy that the new media is positioning themselves as being truth tellers and revealing what's really going on behind the scenes in Hollywood or on the big media. Or it's a tragedy because they're doing the same thing. So, for example, your example with her clipping that part of the speech to totally misconstrue it. Another one I've been following on Instagram called DC Drano. I thought he was a clever guy, but now he's been posting the same kind of stuff. So there's a video of taken from the back of the Austrian parliament, and Zelensky speaking on the screen, and the deputies are leaving, and the way he comments it, describes it as the MPs of Austrian parliament are leaving just as Zelensky is starting to speak. Finally, Europe is opening their eyes on this dancing dictator. Well, I thought, what the hell is this? And so I went to see what was happening. And of course, turned out that it was taken from the back of the parliament. So you see people right in front of you stand up and you think everybody's leaving. But really, it was 20% leaving. And who were those people? It was the GDP party, which clearly was pro-Russian because, the German-speaking countries have a special relationship with Russia and they have a hard time breaking up with them. So they all left. Majority of people stayed. And for sure, this guy knew it. For sure, at least he should have done his homework and seen what was happening. But it's such a disappointment for channels who are saying, we are the truth tellers. We're telling you what's actually going on. For them to so obviously fabricate their data is just disappointing. Because now I'm thinking, is Biden really that corrupt? Is he really that bad? Because have you been lying to me about this stuff? Because I happen to know a thing or two about the war in Ukraine.
Why do you think they're doing this? What's their motivation? So for Candace, why so passionate go against Zelensky in relation against Ukraine? Any support being sent to Ukraine? Why take such a hard line against supporting Ukraine?
I think in his second book, Jordan Peterson has one of the rules of his life. It's called abandon ideology. And it's a great rule because, when you go too far within certain ideology, let's say the conservative ideology or libertarian, as most of the people who are on these channels are, when you go too far, then you become allegiant to the ideology rather than to the welfare of people you're trying to serve. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of these personalities in the conservative movement who are hell-bent on throw everything under the bus if it advances their cause. So, for example, in this case, I think anything that President Biden is doing, they have to condemn, and everything that's associated with the left. For example, the Trump Jr., every tweet of his starts with, well, I understand that Ukraine is the new religion of the left. Leave Ukraine out of this. If you want to wail on the left, cool, I'll probably join you at some point, but don't use Ukraine to advance your ideological cause. And I think that's the biggest reason is anything that the left or Biden finds favorable or supports, they have to oppose, because this is the abuse of ideology.
And that's so interesting that they would go to such far extent to where when I think of Republicans and conservatives, I'm thinking of military dudes, America, we're powerful, we're the boss of the world. And then here, the more conservative, more the Ken Owens and DC Draino and these guys, that were anything that Putin says, right away it's like, oh my gosh, we're so scared of him. We need to listen to him. We need to obey to what he says. We need to give what he's asking for, or else he's gonna kill us all. He's the new boss, and we're so scared of him, and we trust every word that he says. So it's interesting to see that pivot, where they're encouraging Americans to kind of have the tail between their legs and be scared of Putin and be scared and terrified of any sort of opposition to Putin.
It's self-imposed. It's self-imposed fear, and it's self-imposed struggle session. Because I did see videos of like bloggers like, oh, we have all these theories about Putin, but that's not what he says. Let's listen to what he says. Why do you listen to what he says? Everything he says has an agenda at the end of it, so that you believe it and he can advance his cause. He will never tell you on camera what he really thinks. He will tell you what you need to hear from his perspective. Doing that, kind of listening to him and taking for face value what he says is true is ludicrous and naive. And secondly, of course, you're going to be scared of him. That's what he's trying to do. And in fact, a lot of the conversation we're fearing escalation, or should we risk World War III, that is self-imposed. Is he threatening with you with World War III? Is he saying anything concrete about this? Yeah, there's like Medvedev, who was the previous puppet president, who when he gets drunk, he starts writing about that. But in reality, look what is happening. You're self-imposing that on yourself. Or if you're, of compromised morals, you would use that as to say, do you conservatives really want to endanger your lives if you help Ukraine? It's preposterous, because the conservative movement has been the one who was always hawkish, who was always assertive of the United States' power in the world. When you think about President Reagan back in the 80s, he stared the Soviet Union down. He was, at times when he needed to be, he was very stern. Speaking in Berlin, he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall." But then when he met Gorbachev, he was very accommodating and polite with him. But he had the internal conviction that he will can stare him down. In today's conservative party, I shouldn't say conservative, Republican, because those are diverging things at this point, unfortunately. But we see people who are getting scared because of the things they imagine themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's on the Republican Party, and especially the more right part of the Republican Party. That's a little bit on that. But two more objections. And I think it was more at the beginning. I think it died out now. The whole idea of, I think it started with Azov and Mariupol, that we are supporting Nazis. We're sending weapons, finances, and all of our support to support Nazi military in Ukraine. What's the explanation for that? And how does Azov have what's their relation to Nazism?
Okay, so first of all, we have to talk about that entire expression of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. The long-term effect of this argument is that people will think, well, since there's a conversation about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, there has to be something to it, So even though it's completely false, but because there's conversation, because there's people mentioning it, as like, what is something to that? So nationalist is not bad. Nationalist just means that people who want to create a government around their nation. And in fact, this has not existed 200 years ago. In 1848, when the Spring of Nations, so forth, was kind of the wave of revolutions swept through Europe, starting with French at the end of 18th century and then through the 19th, people started realizing that, we're a German nation. We're Italians, even though before we were just like Bourbons and all those fiefdoms. So that idea is pretty new. Like we act like this was from the very beginning, because there was nation of Israel, and then since then, well, that's not how Middle Ages work. That's not how most of the time works. So nationalism is the idea that you want to build a government around your nation, and actually the conservative movement is around that. Like we want to protect America. We want to protect our people and build a people with our values. I fully support that. There's nothing about that. Secondly, the term of Nazism, Nazism died in World War II. They're imposing the shortcut from the party called National Socialist Party back in Germany. They're trying to impose it to create a certain aura around Ukraine that would give the negative connotation. If they're Nazis, Zelensky must be Hitler. So that's a total manipulation. So there's no nationalist social party in Ukraine. We can talk about parties which are radical right, so could be comparable to, let's say, MAGA coalition. There have been in 2014 one of the leaders of the Maidan. His last name was Technibok, and he was he had a party called Svoboda. Remember their logos, something like that, and he was of the radical right, and he did have extreme nationalistic traditions. So he would say stuff like, we have to protect Ukraine for Ukrainians. Like there's no place here for others, like there are Jews and stuff like that. They did have anti-Semitic tendencies. And then they tried to elect themselves into the parliament, and they got less than 1%. Like it had one seat. And since then they have disbanded. So as far as the radical right, radical nationalist movements, yes, there is some, of course. Every country has that, and then Azov does come from that line of thinking. But as far as being radical, ban all the Jews and stuff like that, that's not happening. They are nationalists, but they're not being genocidal or exclusive of other nations.
And I think evidence for that is that we have not heard of any of this until we started hearing from Russian propaganda and why they're going and how there's a huge Nazism problem in Ukraine. Before that, we've never heard somebody being tortured, killed by some military groups in Ukraine. It was groups that if there's a population of over 40 million people, there'll be people that, ultra-right, have weird beliefs, weird views, but that doesn't reflect on the country as a whole and the people.
Remember, a few years back, there was an uproar in the United States about the neo-Nazis march in Charlottesville, back here. And that narrative propagated only until it was not politically beneficial anymore. They used it to mar Trump and say, well, he is one of them because he said there were good people on both sides, which was a misinterpretation, of course. But you see this narrative being brought up when it's politically advantageous. So, but of course, what are you talking about? Nazis have taken over control. There's right now in the parliament of Ukraine, in the office of the president, in the judicial system, there's nobody who is radically nationalistic. That's totally made up.
Another question, the argument is being made the freedom of religion is being suppressed by Zelensky
Right.
because of him shutting down the Orthodox Church in Kiev. What is that all about?
Yeah. So when was this? Back probably end of summer last year, there was a bill passed in Ukraine, which later came into law, banning the activities of Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Russian Patriarchy. So that is a convoluted history of how Russian Orthodox Church or Russian Patriarchy came into Ukraine and why they now occupy most of the buildings. But the simple version of it is that Russia uses its religious institutions, more particularly the Orthodox Church, to exert influence onto the political sphere of other countries. So that basically the Russia prostitutes its church in order to gain their own political outcomes. So, for example, a lot of the priests in the Russian church in Ukraine, they are either agents or of influence or of surveillance, or are employed by FSB, and FSB, of course, is the Senate of KGB in Ukraine. So that is not church. So recently, the statistic was that people who associate themselves with with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Russian Moscow Patriarchy are about like 4%. So it's not a persecution. It's they've ousted the people who are the church patriarchy who was in Lavra in the central Ukrainian cathedral because there were agents of influence, but also because there was massive corruption going on there. And like in Ukraine, everybody knows who the main priest is, Pasha Mercedes, right? And what kind of dealings they've had. So it's in Ukraine historically, because of Russian influence, Russian Empire, there has not been a separation of church and state. They are sort of been melted down, and unfortunately, as it usually happens in church history, the church ends up being the slave of the state and doing its bidding. So that's what was going on in Ukraine. There's my dad is a pastor. He's still a pastor in Cherkasy, and I can tell you there is like Baptist, Protestant generally, like Pentecostal, whatever, chaplains in Ukrainian army, and there's more training going on because the armed forces of Ukraine are inviting spiritual leaders along with psychologists as well to provide support for our troops in Ukraine.
I think that's all from my end. Anything you would like to add? Anything that you hear, the topics or objections that come up when it comes to war, Zelensky, Ukraine? But I think yeah. Overall, I think a lot of random memes or random clips that are sent to me are out of context. Where if I ask any probing questions of, well, how does this justify Putin starting war, invading Ukraine and doing to the people what he's doing there? It's always like, oh, okay, look, well, I'm just saying things look shady. Is never like a hard evidence for anything. It's more of like, oh, this looks suspicious to me. Oh, this looks weird to me. Another one that comes to mind right now is that ties of Biden and Hunter Biden to Ukrainian businesses.
Burisma.
And therefore, so I'm like, okay, so let's say Hunter is tied to Burisma. So therefore, how does this lead to explaining the Putin is justified invading Ukraine? Because as a politician, especially if you're in politics for 40, 45 years, yes, you're going to have political ties, you're going to have money, corruption, all those things. But at the end of the day, if we see any clip, any questionable meme, I think that to add full context to it is to ask ourselves, well, how does this justify Putin invading Ukraine and doing what he did in Bucha, Mariupol, and other cities?
Just follow through. Exactly. As you're saying, like, well, if you see a piece of evidence that you think is damning to Ukraine, follow it through. So knowing what we know, how should this change our behavior? Or how does this change our view on Ukraine? So, for example, I think we should address the corruption in Ukraine because there is corruption in Ukraine. But the narrative of let's not send aid to Ukraine because Ukraine is corrupt, that's not going anywhere. all the countries are corrupt. I don't know a country that is not politically or economically corrupt, right? So, and I was talking over email with a founder of Friends of Ukraine Foundation, Robert McConnell, and he brought up a really good point. He says the corporations who are licking their chops at Ukraine reconstruction contracts, the billions of dollars to restore Mariupol, to restore all these cities, they don't have the same objection as when it comes to Ukraine. So when it's advantageous to say we want to keep our money in the United States, then, well, Ukraine is corrupt, let's not send it there. But then when it comes to the same people at the head of these construction companies, like, oh, we don't care that it's corrupt, we're there to rebuild. Of course, Ukraine is corrupt. Of course, it's a problem that we will have to overcome. But again, as you said, what kind of influence does it have on the behavior? Should we stop sending aid to Ukraine? To what means? And to say that corruption is a very wide term, right? Corruption refers to oligarchy, to misuse of governmental funds and the budget and things of that nature. But are we seeing that this is happening with American aid? It would be suicidal for Ukrainian government, for the office of a president, to get involved in any corruption scandal, because if that comes to light, then the aid is over and they've just ended Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They're not that stupid. Like they would not be playing with fire like that. So unless there's evidence, you can actually say it's corrupt. Like everybody's corrupt. Like all the countries are corrupt. Unless you see something that's where you see American taxpayers' hard-earned money being misused or being used to buy property for the richest in Ukraine. Where's that? Tell me that. You can gossip. To me, it kind of sounds it's just like a gossip girl right now. It's just like she's just spewing stuff, no evidence, no nothing. I'll just say stuff. So unless you have something hard we can discuss, then don't make these broad strokes. They don't help anything. They just muddy the waters.
Yuri, thank you for coming on. Thank you for this conversation. You do a great job of giving detailed updates on the war, on the progress of the war. Where can somebody find you, follow you to get those updates? Yeah, so
I've not done a good job propagating those, but at the beginning of the war, I saw that people are confused about what's going on in Ukraine, and my friends from the States told me that we cannot trust our own media. What is going on? So I started recording these updates. They're on my Facebook, and then my Ukrainian language podcast, Думки перехожих, which is thoughts of passersby on YouTube. There's a section there, like a playlist of all the updates. It's called Ukraine War Chronicles. So you can see it there. I upload it once in a while.
I always look forward to those and get more detailed information on the process of the war and objections and questions and concerns that the people have, and just to be more informed in more details. So thank you for doing those, and those that are interested can find you and follow you. But thank you for tonight.
Yeah, thanks. This is an important conversation. Thanks for doing this podcast. This is great.
All right. Thank you.